first question is, I understand you worked with Bob Dole for many years. Talk to me about what you remember most about who he was as a person.
Gosh, he was a very complicated person. And he would be the first to say he probably wasn't well served by television until late, oddly enough in his career, after 96. You're too young to remember, but within 3 days of losing convincingly to Bill Clinton, he appeared on the David Letterman show. And they were flooded with mail afterwards from people who said, I had no idea he was so funny. And as long as I knew him, and we were friends for over 40 years, people were saying the same thing. I had no idea he had a sense of humor. And that's just one small way that, as I say, the television camera was not always his friend. Anyway, I was a speechwriter, and occasionally pressed into service, I guess you could say, as a very unofficial political advisor. But mostly I wrote speeches. And one of them that was particularly memorable was for Richard Nixon's funeral. And people knew that Dole and Nixon were close. It was, again, it's part of the complexity of Dole. It's an odd relationship because Dole had been, some people think, overly defensive of Nixon during the '72 campaign. And after the '72 campaign, Nixon, in effect, fired him as head of the Republican National Committee. And yet they remained very close. And I'll tell you how close. Nixon never did an uncalculated thing in his life. And that included planning his own funeral. And he wanted Dole to be one of the eulogists. But Nixon, being Nixon and knowing Dole as well as he did, knew that Dole, contrary to his public image, would not be able to get all the way through a eulogy without breaking down. And I wrote the eulogy, and he broke down, and it was exactly what Nixon had intended. And because Nixon was shrewd enough, maybe cynical enough, to know that for Dole to display his emotions so publicly would in fact counter the public image that he had among many people. So Richard Nixon was not above using his own funeral as a platform to launch his candidate for '96.
So let's talk about his impact on American politics. What do you remember most from what he did in his time in the Senate?
Gosh, there are so many ways of answering that. You can look at legislation. The Americans with Disabilities Act might very well not have passed, but also the Martin Luther King birthday bill, which Dole shepherded through the United States Senate. There's a whole host. Social Security was arguably saved during the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, by a bipartisan committee with Dole and Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Alan Greenspan. So anyone who's receiving a Social Security check this month, they have Bob Dole in part to thank for that. That's the legislative side. But I think he will be remembered more for the personal story, which is extraordinary. It's remarkable that anyone lives to be 98. It is miraculous that this man lived to be 98, when you know that when he was 24, 25, the doctors didn't expect him to live 24 hours. I mean, it is the Dole legend, which, unlike many legends, happens to be grounded in fact, that I think people will remember this week and for years to come. A young Kansan, wanted to be a doctor, ironically, went off to war, was grievously wounded in the closing days of the war in northern Italy, spent the better part of 3 years in hospitals on both sides of the Atlantic, went through one medical crisis after another, became, by the way, the guinea pig. He was the first patient to receive a miracle drug called streptomycin, which today, of course, we all take for granted. But it turned out, guess what? It worked. It produced the miracle. And there was one miracle after another in many ways in Dole's life. So that losing the presidency, whether in 1988 or in 1996, when he was the actual nominee of his party, I think it hurt. But he put it in perspective compared to what he had been through, compared to what he had overcome. Dealing with the defeat at the polls was pretty small potatoes.
You just led right into this, talking about, the bid for presidency. Let's talk about his, can you explain his relationship with Gerald Ford and that partnership in that bid for office?
Well, first of all, like you said, Bob Dole was of the generation, one of the last probably of the generation, who believed that there was something almost sacred about the presidency, that if a president asked you to do something, you did it. Gerald Ford, of course, and he had been in Congress together. Ford got there a dozen years earlier, and in the House. Dole actually provided the votes that made Ford House Minority Leader in January 1965. And so it wasn't that unusual to think a decade later that Ford would return the favor on an even larger scale by making Bob Dole his running mate in 76. Now, there was criticism of Dole's campaign in 76, and particularly of the debate in which he talked about Democrat wars. Two things about that. It's interesting. Ford himself never joined the criticism. He always pointed out Bob Dole was put on the ticket for one reason, and that was to win back the Farm Belt. Republicans were in deep, deep trouble, really throughout the country. Remember, Jimmy Carter had a 30-point lead at the beginning of the campaign, but the Republican base was not there. And Dole's mission was to bring it back, and arguably he did. They carried all but a couple states west of the Mississippi. The other thing that is very personal, I'll never forget, I interviewed Walter Mondale late in his life, and it's interesting. He said, "I'm a Bob Dole fan." And we talked about that debate, and we talked about Democrat wars, and Mondale, who obviously was Dole's political opposite, was like Dole in that he was of the generation that believed that in the end, you were measured by what you got done, not what you kept from being done, which is what is so much of our current political malaise, I would argue. Dole would certainly not be at home in the Senate today. Gerald Ford was the same way. He was in the minority throughout most of his congressional career, but even so, at the end of the day, it mattered that you got the best deal you could get, you got the best legislation you could get, you got something that you could take home to the folks and as a tangible achievement. And so in a sense, the loss of Senator Dole, Walter Mondale, Vice President Mondale earlier this year, I mean, it's a real turning of the page. It's the loss of a particular kind of politics, as well as a kind of pragmatism and bipartisanship. I mean, Dole, like Ford, never confused compromise with surrender. And that all by itself makes him alien in some ways to the kind of scorched earth politics that we have today.
That's really fascinating, talking about the differences, in political idealism between, that set of time and now. Hang on, let me reverse this.
Well, and it wasn't as if they weren't intensely partisan, or they didn't. I mean, the 1970s were no era of good feeling. As anyone who lived through it, can attest, Vietnam and Watergate. I mean, there was a lot of poison in the well. But the interesting thing, it's a cliche almost, but it's a cliche because it's true. It was possible for people like Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, but Gerald Ford and Tip O'Neill were great friends who would beat up on each other all day, and then after 6 o'clock were the best of friends. And I think it's hard for people today either to understand that, or they think that's some kind of hypocrisy, behind that. But that's the way politics worked 50 years ago. And call me nostalgic, but it adds a special sense of loss, it seems to me, to what this day already represents.
Mhm. Let's talk about Dole's bid for the White House. Why was he compelled to make that change, make that run, and what difference did he think he could make?
That's I have a very personal memory of that. He told me later on he never should have run in '96. That '88 was his year. And in fact, if you look back, people don't realize how close he came in '88. He, of course, won in Iowa. He always referred to himself as the president of Iowa. And 3 days before the New Hampshire primary, he was leading Vice President Bush. And then it just all collapsed. But '88 was the logical year for him to run. '96, I don't think he ever thought that he was going to defeat Bill Clinton. And in fact, I know at one point he spoke about how difficult it was. And he was not a complainer, the last person in the world to complain about such things. But he was out on the road day after day after day, pretending that he was going to win. And being hit day after day with bad polls and bad press columns and so on. And the one thing that really, really bothered him was then to have people in his own campaign who were leaking to make themselves look good. Well, that's part of Washington. That's another thing about Dole. He was in Washington, lived in Washington for 60 years. And yet what really counted about him, and I thought he never left Russell, Kansas. I mean, he brought that set of values that he brought to Washington originally in 1960, and he kept them. And with them all a sense of humor about what they were doing. This isn't brain surgery. No one is perfect. No one is as good as they are made out to be in the press, and probably no one is as bad. And that was part of that sort of pragmatic outlook that he brought with him. Another thing, it's interesting, he was, I called the original compassionate conservative. He came from very modest surroundings, and he had experienced the Dust Bowl in Kansas, and would talk about these great midday blizzards of dirt that would roll across the prairie and envelop whole towns and send people scurrying for shelter. And in his very modest house, that was a signal to stuff towels under the door to try to keep the dust out. And he was surrounded by people who were weathering the Great Depression. And he saw people, when he was county attorney, he, on more than one occasion, had to sign welfare checks for his grandparents. And the experience, I think, seared itself in him for life. He knew that they were good people, decent, hardworking people, who through no fault of their own were not able to make it. And he never forgot that. And there was a little bit of the populist, the Kansas populist in him that he took with him, as I say, to Washington, and I think kept until the end of his life.
You mentioned his sense of humor. I think a lot of people will remember him for speaking in third person often. What was that about, and how did that speak to his personality?
It's a great question. I have no idea where it came from, and I never asked him. I never screwed up the courage to ask him, but I know he saw the joke in it. He was in on the joke, of course. You know, he showed up on Saturday Night Live once. I think it was maybe Norm Macdonald who did a great Bob Dole impersonation, and he showed up, and of course, you know, Bob Dole's upset. Bob Dole, you know, he played into the gag. But where it came from, I do not know. It's a good question. It would be a fascinating thing to find out. I mean, it suggests an element of detachment. There were people who thought he wasn't running for president so much as he was sort of standing by watching the race for president and commenting on it, often humorously. And there was something. I mean, he had a very healthy sense of the ridiculous. And that's the only way probably to get through politics, through a political career. That the difference is that most people don't show it or indulge it. And he did. Sometimes it got him in trouble.
Now that people are going to be remembering him so much this week and talking about his life, what do you want people to remember about him?
His decency. Other people will talk about and debate his skills as a campaigner, or whether, quite frankly, he pushed party loyalty to the limit. There are certainly people who believe that he defended Nixon more than he should have in '72. There are certainly people who believe that he defended Donald Trump more than he ought to have more recently. And that's all part of the historical discussion that will play out. But right now, you know, I'm thinking of his decency and his generosity. Again, people don't know. He wasn't the sort to discuss it in public, but he was extraordinarily generous, not just to family and friends, but to a lot of charitable organizations. You know, there's a lot we don't know about Dole, I think, and over time that will become perhaps better known and more appreciated. But and I think maybe most important of all, his growth. You know, Americans like to think, certainly they think that presidents, the minute they put their hand on the Bible and take that sacred oath, that a process begins where they grow, they become more fill in the blank. But in Dole's case, he never got to take that oath. One of the jokes he played it was interesting. His relationship with Bill Clinton is one of the things that people should remember, because needless to say, they ran against each other in '96. And right after Clinton invited Dole to the White House, he gave him the Medal of Freedom. And Dole said that he had hoped that week, which was inauguration week, to be receiving the keys to the White House from President Clinton, but he was certainly grateful to receive the Medal of Freedom. And afterwards, Clinton took him into another room on the ground floor, the first floor of the White House, and there was a model of the World War II memorial in its current design. Anyway, make a long story short, before that day was over, he basically signed up Dole to be primarily responsible for raising the money for the World War II memorial. And that's one of the things people should remember. You know, lots of people lose an election and they disappear. They kind of fade away for whatever reason, because they are essentially one thing. They're politicians and they run for office. And if they're not in office, they almost don't exist. The really remarkable thing about Dole is, in some ways, he really kind of blossomed after '96. He refused to dwell on what might have been. And again, typical Midwest pragmatic sort that he was, he got on with doing constructive things. And one of them was he wanted to live long enough to see the World War II memorial built. And of course, as you remember, there was criticism of the design and the location, putting it on the mall and so on and so on. And typical great Dole lie, because some woman founded some advocacy group called Save Our Mall. And Dole's response, of course, was, we already saved it once. It was called World War II. And I don't think he heard from her again. But he lived to see the World War II memorial built. And then the Eisenhower Memorial, which is opened just within the last year. He was instrumental in raising funds for that. And finally, his legacy, he would want people to concentrate on. At the University of Kansas, after he lost in '96, talks began. And basically, he established the Dole Institute of Politics, and it was exactly the opposite of what you might have expected in 1968, 69, when he was a very partisan Republican and Nixon supporter. He insisted that it be bipartisan. He wanted it to be, in some ways, an antidote to the kind of bitterly partisan politics that seem to consume us today. And so, interesting enough, Bill Clinton spoke, Walter Mondale spoke, a number of people, the President Bush, who of course had a bitter rivalry with Dole in 1988. I think the image that a lot of people who only knew him in his later years might have this week is that extraordinary picture when President Bush died recently and was lying in state in the rotunda. And who should come to pay him respect but Bob Dole in his wheelchair, and an aide with considerable difficulty managed to get him to his feet, and Dole saluted his commander-in-chief, the man who had been at one time a bitter rival and who became genuinely a very close friend. And that is the trajectory of Dole's life that I think people ought to at least take into consideration along with everything else.